Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll talk about last week's primary election results. You can join our discussion by calling us toll-free at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. But first, we're joined by Bruce Siwy, Capitol Bureau reporter for USA Today. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
You wrote that voter turnout in last week's primary election was about 30% and that nearly 250,000 voters selected a presidential candidate that had already conceded and is no longer campaigning. What do you conclude from that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple different reasons for that potentially. I spoke with Kyle Kondik, who's a political analyst for the University of Virginia Center of Politics. One of the things that he noted was that there's sometimes a lag between voter registration and actual voter sentiment. There are situations where there might be an individual who's still registered as a Republican but has been voting Democrat for several cycles, and vice versa. Democrats that are voting Republican through several cycles. And he thought that could be, part of that you might have a county that is maybe more rural, like Cambria County is a good example of that, where the voter registration trends have slowly been trending toward Republican for years, but there are still people who are identified as Democrats voting Republican. In Southeast Pennsylvania, it's sort of the opposite, where you have Republicans there that probably vote more for Democrats. So part of that vote in a primary could be a result of that. Those are individuals who are, Republicans who are never going to vote for Trump or Democrats who are never going to vote for Biden. The other part of it, I think, comes down to the popularity. And you can see that poll after poll after poll, depending on, or no matter what outlet you look at, you're seeing that these candidates, the primary candidates of Joe Biden and Donald Trump, are pretty much underwater in terms of favorability. And so I think there is a little bit of that voter disgust being portrayed in some of that turnout and in the way that people voted.
If voters lack enthusiasm for either of the major party presidential candidates, what role do you see third-party candidates having as we head to the general?
Oh, they could have a huge impact, I think, in a swing state like Pennsylvania. I mean, if you look back at the last election cycle, I think it was 80,000 votes or something like that separating these two individuals. And looking at this cycle now, you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Trying to get on the ballot as an independent. You have Cornel West also attempting to get on the ballot. I think Jill Steen is another one. So if the three of them especially get on the ballot, and we're looking at narrow margins in a swing state like Pennsylvania, they could have a huge impact on who's ultimately winning that state. And Pennsylvania is one of pretty much a handful of states that's largely and widely expected to be determining the outcome of this race. So I think that's absolutely something to watch for.
You wrote that younger voters in particular are lacking enthusiasm for a Trump-Biden rematch. Why do they feel this way?
Well, one of the people that I interviewed for this particular article is a professor at Chatham University, and she said that just in a lot of ways, it's a lot of the issues that they choose to focus on or talk about. Younger voters aren't really responding to or don't feel that they're being spoken to. You do have two individuals around 80 years old running for office, and that might be somewhat of a turnoff. And it's one of those situations where as these campaigns get into full swing coming into the summer, you really feel that they're going to have to really try to speak to those voters because, whether they decide to stay home or vote third party, they could have an impact on which way this goes. And so I think President Biden was able to get some of those young voters and independent voters in his camp to win in 2020. And obviously his campaign will probably be working overtime to try to get them back out to the polls and voting for him.
What are some of the specific issues that the presidential candidates need to focus on to engage more with these younger voters?
I know that climate change is one that, on college campuses that they talk about a lot. Another one that's sort of interesting, and I think a particularly tricky one to navigate, is the conflict between Israel and Hamas. You're seeing protests on college campuses and voters, young voters in particular, not really happy with the way things are unfolding over there. And it's a very, very tricky and complicated issue for any candidate to navigate. And it'll be very interesting to see how that impacts the way that they talk about that conflict and how they try to rally those types of voters.
You spoke with Joseph Morse of Mercyhurst University, who said, quote, people just don't like these candidates, end quote. How did Pennsylvania end up with presidential candidates that they don't really like?
Well, I think that that's also a product of a late primary. We are in a situation here in Pennsylvania where we're not typically voting for our nominees until April, usually the end of the month. And by that time, most of the country has already kind of gone out and done that. And this year in particular was pretty extreme where, you had somebody like, for example, Ron DeSantis, who maybe at this time last year, people were thinking was really going to give Donald Trump a fight in the Republican primary. And he pulled very poorly and didn't do all that well in Iowa, wasn't particularly close there, and dropped out fairly early. Nikki Haley stuck around for a little bit longer, but she also has since conceded and dropped out. And so, yes, every year Pennsylvania is at a disadvantage in terms of having a voice in who the candidates are. And this year in particular, it was a pretty dire example of that where both of these individuals have locked up their nominations, and it's more of a formality at this point.
For those who cast protest votes in the presidential vote last week, what do you think they'll do in the fall?
I think that's the million-dollar question. That's something that I pose to many political experts. And I think part of it's going to come down to whether these independent third-party candidates get on the ballot. I think those are voters who are absolutely showing some disgust with their current choices on the Republican and Democratic tickets. And if they see another name on the ballot, maybe that's who they pull the lever for. So I think we need to pay particular attention to who's able to get on the ballot. And for the major campaigns, for the Trump and Biden campaigns, I think they're going to, as I mentioned, have to work extremely hard, not just pandering to their base, but working hard to get those young voters, independent voters, those swing voters, because those will be the ones who determine this race.
Bruce Siwy, good talking with you this morning.
All right, good to talk to you as well. Thanks.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after this short break. Welcome back. Our guests today are Berwood Yost, Director of the Center for Opinion Research at Franklin and Marshall College, and Fletcher McClellan, Professor of Political Science at Elizabethtown College. Fletcher, we'll start with you. It's been nearly a week since Pennsylvania's primary election. Did anything surprise you in the results?
Not very much. I think you could tease out some interesting trends and things like that. But if you were an incumbent, for example, chances are that you didn't have an opponent, and those that did fairly well. There was one upset in the state treasurer's race for the Democratic nomination. And the winner, whose name is McClellan, who is no relation, although if she wins, I could add a letter to my name and ask her for a favor. But but other than that, I think what people were looking for were for example, turnout, which was fairly low for a presidential primary. They were looking to see how well President Biden and former President Trump would do and whether there were any trends in that direction.
Berwood, what stood out to you?
Good morning, Francine, Fletcher. I think some of the same sorts of things that Fletcher emphasized stuck out to me. The turnout was decidedly low. Compare it to 2022, that midterm race where there was a lot of enthusiasm for those primaries. We had a lot of candidates to choose from. So I think one of the big stories was just how sort of apathetic and unengaged voters were. I think the other big story, we can get to the upset in the treasurer's race, and I'm not sure I'd call it an upset. Maybe a surprise is the right term, but the other side of this was former President Trump's performance in the primary and the number of Republican voters. Remember, we're a closed primary state where only registered Republicans could vote. And a lot of those voters chose to vote for Nikki Haley, who suspended her campaign instead of President Trump. I don't know what that means for November, but it certainly is interesting and points to the schism or the divide that remains in the Republican electorate. And I think the other part of that, which I was fiddling around with the numbers over the weekend, in the areas where President Trump did worse, which generally were Southeast PA and suburban communities, the turnout was also generally lower in those places. And so I haven't pieced together what all that means, but it strikes me that it must mean something important.
Reminder to our viewers that you're welcome to join in on our discussion. Our toll-free number is 1-877-PA6-5001, or you can text us at 717-219-4001. And we're going to take our first call already. John is calling from Easton. Go ahead, John.
Oh, hi. I was wondering if any your guests there can explain to me why our turnout in Pennsylvania and in this country is so poor. Whereas when you're in a dictatorship like a country, like, let's say where there's a dictator and they allow voting, the bullets winging over the people's heads and 95% of the population shows up to vote. I mean, you know, when was the last time we had a 50% or more population show up to vote? If you know that. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Well, there was, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Yost, but we had about 70% turnout in the general election in 2020, the presidential election. Primary elections are, normally low unless they're really competitive races. Of course, in Pennsylvania, we have a closed primary, so independents are not voting. And when we talk about 25% of turnout, in this primary, we're talking about 25% just of partisans. I think you need really competitive races, especially up and down the ticket to really mobilize turnout. Now, we are seeing, of course, at the very local level, we have school board races and things like that, and those sorts of things have become actually nationalized on issues such as book banning. So we may be seeing sort of at the grassroots greater political interest.
Berwood, any additional thoughts on why? Was it voter apathy, or why did voters not come to the polls?
Well, look, I think there's probably a couple things going on. One, Fletcher touched on it earlier, and that is there are a lot of races where there's no choice to make. So you're not getting to choose in a primary. Whenever there's a primary that has multiple candidates running, you normally see higher turnout. The other thing that's important is that the candidates themselves are spending money and saying to voters, this is competitive and you have a choice to make. We know when more money is spent on these races, more people turn out to vote. And so it's a combination of, it really boils down to competition. And people are more likely to come and vote when the races are competitive and there's something at stake. And unfortunately, in many of our primaries, we just don't have that much at stake.
Berwood, I'd like to come back to you for a second. You were quoted in the Delaware County Times last week as saying, quote, "We're at a point with polarization in politics where policy matters less than emotion," end quote. Why is eliciting emotion so important, and what candidates do you think do that well?
Well, I think, I don't want to overstate the point, but I was emphasizing some research that we've done in our own polling that suggests that people are so set and with polarization being a fact of life, where in fact we really hate our opponents and feel better about our own team, and there's a really kind of a team feeling about all of this, that connecting with voters emotionally seems to be essential in this day and age, because policy seems to take a back seat in many instances for many voters, not all, but for many voters, particularly base voters. And I think what I was trying to suggest there was particularly for President Biden, that he has not done a good job of emotionally connecting with his base. And he's got to do that if he's going to win again. And so that was the point I was trying to make. President Trump, he's connected emotionally with his base. President Biden needs to do the same.
Well, I agree, certainly. The fact that we have two candidates that are well known to voters, what piece of information could you possibly need to have a preference? I think I'm surprised there are any undecided voters out there, frankly, when you're dealing in a race with two incumbents, in essence, running against each other.
Now, earlier on in the program, before the two of you joined us, I was speaking with Bruce Siwy of the USA Today Network, talking about how younger voters in particular didn't feel particularly connected to these two presidential candidates. Are there other key demographics or specific demographics that these candidates really need to seek out to bring in more voters in the fall?
Well, education seems to be a very important dividing line, increasingly in the vote. In fact, more educated voters, as formal education, are trending Democratic, and less educated, fewer years formal schooling, are trending Republican. And this is sort of a historic change. So we'll see, for example, Democrats really pushing turnout efforts in the suburbs. Former President Trump got unbelievable turnout in rural areas, and certainly he'll emphasize that. I think education is certainly one of these issues. Pennsylvania is an older state, so we have to pay as much attention to older voters as we do to the young.
Berwood, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I think there's two things to keep in mind here. One, and Fletcher hinted at this, was geography. In the state, in the primary, for example, I think it reinforced the trends that we've seen. The suburban voters kind of feeling reluctant to support President Trump. That's where he did worst among Republicans. And President Biden doing worse among rural Democratic voters. And that reinforces a trend that we've seen before. So I think one of the keys in this election demographically is which of these candidates can eat into the geographic advantage of the other. Can President Biden maintain his advantage in the suburbs and perhaps eat away at the rural areas and Trump support there, or vice versa for President Trump? So I think that's really important. I think what you said about young voters, particularly minority voters, that's probably essential for Democrats as well. When we talk about President Biden's loss of support among state voters and assessments of his job approval, it's really among liberals, progressives, younger voters, voters of color, where he has lost support. These people who should be part of his base have said, we're not wild about the job he's doing. And so he's got to win those back and then worry about those geographic divides that I mentioned.
I'd like to take one more look at the numbers in the presidential race. First, in the Democratic primary, Joe Biden, these are the latest numbers from the Department of State, by the way, 945,000 over Dean Phillips with roughly 69,000. And then in the Republican primary, President Trump with roughly 791,000 over Nikki Haley with 157,000. Can you talk a little bit about what gets accomplished for voting for somebody that's no longer in the running, or by doing a write-in that says uncommitted? What ultimately gets accomplished, and how do you see that translating into the fall?
Well, I would see those voters as sending a message, because they're not thinking about associating with a winning candidate. With former President Trump, the Haley voters could be saying something about his criminal trials, the various legal proceedings that he's in. Could be saying something about his style. They could be saying something about his policies, whether it has to deal with abortion rights or immigration. On the Democratic side, I think it is fascinating. There were, 50,000 votes for Congressman Phillips, and there is estimated to be another 55,000 voters who basically wrote in a vote, which that vote, as I understand it, is really split. Rural Democrats were more likely to write in and express no preference, and also voters in some of the more progressive areas of Philadelphia. And that is linked to the president's policies on the Israel-Hamas war. Those are real, especially the Israel-Hamas war, I think is going to be a real problem for him. It is already in other states. But here in Pennsylvania, we have young people, minorities. We have a campus movement in some colleges and universities here in the Commonwealth and elsewhere. I don't see, on the Israeli side, and I do not profess to be an expert on the Middle East, but I don't see this thing ending anytime soon. Prime Minister Netanyahu, I don't think it's in his personal political interest to suspend activities very soon. He probably thinks he's going to get a better deal out of a second Trump administration.
Bird, your thoughts?
Yeah, just a couple things. I mean, I think Fletcher's right. We're not really sure what it could be any number of things that represents their protest and dissatisfaction with the candidates at the top of the ticket. And we know from our polling that 1 in 5 voters has an unfavorable view of both of these candidates. And so it's no secret that there's lots of people who are looking for an alternative. I mean, I thought there were a couple of things that were really interesting to me on the Democratic side. We've already talked about former President Trump and his kind of weak support in some areas. I thought 2 things were interesting. One is that last I checked, Senator Casey received more votes than people voted for the president at the top of the ticket, which this is kind of curious and tells you something else about, normally people vote at the top and roll off for lower races. And I think that's something to think about. I think the other thing to think about moving forward is the turnout among Democrats in Philadelphia was like less than 20%. I mean, it was abysmal. And going back to the prior response about the geographic component of the election, the suburban areas are important for Biden, the rural areas are important for Trump, but the urban areas are vital, particularly Philadelphia, are vital for President Biden. And if he doesn't have a substantial turnout in that area, that part of Pennsylvania, he's cooked.
Berwood, what do you think about the potential inclusion of third-party candidates? Can you kind of determine if specific candidates, whether it's RFK Jr., Jill Stein, whoever, who they might siphon votes away from?
So in our last statewide poll, we did an experiment. And so instead of asking people who they supported between 2 candidates and then asking another question, which isn't exactly a test, we randomly assigned people to getting either Biden versus Trump or Biden, Trump, and third-party candidates. And what we found was that the third-party candidates, at least in Pennsylvania, hurt Biden more than they hurt Trump, and that RFK, should he be on the ballot, siphoned a good many votes away from both candidates, but more so from President Biden. And so one of the key factors going into this November election is going to be the composition of the final ballot. Who is it that's on the ballot? How many third-party candidates are there? Which ones are they? Because I think to answer your question about who's it hurt more, it's going to depend how many there are and who they are. And we don't know that yet.
Yeah, I think this is unknowable. I think it's such a wild card. In fact, now it appears that that Trump is getting more worried about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And he is, Trump, for example, has had an interesting relationship with the anti-vaccine movement, which Kennedy Jr. is a leader of. He has cozied himself up to anti-vax voters. At the same time, he wants to take credit for helping develop the vaccine, which dealt with COVID. I just, as Berwood said, I don't know what the impact will be depending on who is running. I think there'll be a surge of interest in third-party candidates at some point because there is, both candidates, Trump and Biden, are not. People are not really looking forward to this rematch. So there'll be a surge, but at the very end, people will be asking themselves, well, if I vote for a third party, will my vote really count? So we'll see that dynamic as well.
Fletcher, a moment ago, you referred to Donald Trump's ongoing trial. How do you see that affecting his candidacy?
Well, it depends how many trials. We have one trial going on now in New York, the so-called hush money or election interference case, which I think has been extraordinarily embarrassing to Trump, not just the evidence, but also his behavior and that sort of thing. But presumably that will be over sometime in the next few weeks or months, and he'll appeal that. The other trials, well, of course, one is being held up because of the Supreme Court. He, I think, has, fairly successfully, at least to his supporters, convince them that this is a sort of a political witch hunt, and that he is actually martyring himself for their cause. So I don't think they're going to be moved at all. On the other hand, you do have independent, undecided voters, however few I think there may be, and they may be affected. But it's very possible that all this is already pretty much baked in, and there isn't going to be any dramatic trials, at least happening during the fall campaign.
Fletcher, do you think the trial will affect the candidacy?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of voters who already have made up their minds. And what we're looking at now are the voters who have to make a choice and who will decide the race. And as Fletcher said, it's a small number, maybe 10%, maybe 15% of voters. In part, it depends how many of them get motivated to go out and vote. So I think among those voters, they're watching carefully. And I think, I think that a conviction probably has some effect on them, as does an acquittal, right? I mean, that we only talk about one side, but there's two sides to every trial. And so, we'll have to see how that plays out. I think what's most important to remember going forward is that this race is going to be volatile. It's going to be close, but it's going to be hard to know who wins, because we've got all these voters who say, I wish we had somebody else. I don't like either candidate. And then we have the potential for all these third-party candidates. And at the end of the day, many voters, there will be a number of voters who will walk into the ballot booth and make up their mind. And that's going to make it hard to predict what happens. And so I think all of us should keep that in mind. I'm keeping that in mind. My expectation is uncertainty as we move towards November.
How important are the national conventions in terms of getting the whole party on board to support their candidate and unite as they head toward the fall?
Well, that's normally their purpose, right? It's to get everybody singing from the same hymnal. I think that both parties have work to do. I think both parties, particularly if I'm the Democrats, I'm concerned about protests around the Israeli war, and that could make things appear more divisive. In fact, I think on the Republican side, what do you do with Haley voters, and who does Nikki Haley endorse is a big question. So, both parties will be hoping to put on a show that unifies their base, but I think there are things floating around that could make that difficult.
The Democrats, I think, are meeting in Chicago, and when you mention Chicago Democrat convention and, as Berwood said, protests, there'll be some recalling of that and sort of comparison. I think the Republicans are in Milwaukee, so there is kind of a strategic purpose there to motivate the vote, especially in that swing state. Yeah,
and I think that what's interesting, though, is I think back to 2016 when the Democrats were in Philadelphia, thinking that was the way to lock down Pennsylvania. It didn't work. So I'm not sure how much effect the conventions really have externally, but I think what matters is that you come out of those conventions with a real bounce and a unified party. And I'm just not sure yet we're going to see that.
We're going to continue our discussion in just a moment. I'd like to remind our viewers, if you'd like to join in, you can call us toll free 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. But first, I'd like to give our guests a brief break and tell you about what's coming up on PCN. The PCN Capitol Preview returns tomorrow morning as we discuss Governor Josh Shapiro's energy plan with Andre Bellevue of the Commonwealth Foundation and Robert Ruth of the National Resources Defense Council. That's tomorrow morning, live at 9 a.m. Khalid Moumin, Pennsylvania Secretary of Education, is the featured speaker at this month's PA Press Club Luncheon. That's live today at 12:30, available on cable or stream with PCN Select. Join us for On the Issues this week. Representative Ryan Warner joins us to explain his proposal to ban sanctuary cities, followed by Carol Kunaholm, co-founder and chair of Fair Districts PA, discussing redistricting. That's Wednesday night, starting at 7. This Thursday, Journalist Roundtable features Charles Thompson from Penn Live, Pat Loeb from KYW News Radio Philadelphia, and Dennis Owens from WHTM-TV in Harrisburg. That's Thursday night at 7 o'clock. All the great public affairs event coverage and interviews you watch at PCN are now available free online at PCNTV.com and on PCN Select. Thank you for watching PCN. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We're relying on viewers and donors like you to help PCN continue to bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Now let's get back into our discussion. We talked about the presidential race. Let's move on to the U.S. Senate race. Now, what should our viewers know about Republican Dave McCormick, incumbent Senator Bob Casey, and what you expect to see between now and November?
Well, I think during primary season we saw strategies emerge. Neither had competition, and both have their party's backing. But Senator Casey, of course, I think is well known to Pennsylvanians, the name and the fact that he's served now close to 20 years in the Senate. He has always come off as kind of a low-key, kind of a worker bee type who, concentrates on getting things done. Lunch pail issues, advocating for seniors, things like that. He often plays against that image. He will do, he'll play some pranks, or he'll do some things that would go against the low-key image. I think he'll simply continue with that, but I think there will be a very strong effort to try to define David McCormick, the Republican nominee, for voters. McCormick, of course, is saying that he is not a politician. He has not held elected public office before. He's not part of the so-called mess in Washington. So he's going to be a strong advocate for Pennsylvania. On the other hand, the Casey campaign and Democrats are saying that he's not even from Pennsylvania. He lives, in a rather affluent lifestyle in Connecticut, and he's out of touch not only with working people, but with Pennsylvanians themselves.
Fletcher, do you think that characterization will be problematic for Dave McCormick?
Well, he's got some. Oh, I'm sorry. He's got some catching up to do because, as I say, Casey is a well-known quantity, and he's already starting to work on McCormick's image.
Berwood, your thoughts? I remember residency was an issue 2 years ago in the U.S. Senate race for Mehmet Oz as well.
It was. Now, I think, to be fair to McCormick, he grew up in Pennsylvania, and he left, and he's sort of, I think he would characterize himself, and many people would, as a success story. He worked in government, when he was in the military, went to West Point. In some ways, he's got a fabulous traditional Republican resume. He's almost a candidate from central casting if this were 2000. But unfortunately for him, I think, or one of the issues that he confronts is that the Republican Party has changed since the 90s. And since we've had a long history of moderate Republicans. Think of Tom Ridge or Arlen Specter or Dick Thornburg. I mean, you go down the list, John Hines. Those are the kind of candidates who traditionally have done very well. And I think actually on the Democratic side, Bob Casey sort of fits that mold well. I think McCormick fits that mold. But in today's GOP, I think he's going to have a struggle. And what he's got to do is something very, I think, difficult. And that is he's got to assemble a slightly different electoral coalition than President Trump. And that probably means a bit more suburban voters, maybe more educated voters. Fletcher talked earlier about the educational divide these days. I think McCormick has a chance to appeal to those kinds of suburban voters that former President Trump has trouble with. But I think Senator Casey, one, it's hard to beat an incumbent. He's going to have ample, he's got a great name recognition. One of the things we know in the polling is that not a lot of people know who Dave McCormick is. Only a little more than half say they have enough knowledge about him to have an opinion. So I think he's got to do a job, McCormick, of defining himself and telling his story before Bob Casey has a chance to tell that story for him, because if he's able to paint McCormick as a carpetbagger, as Oz was painting, then that's going to be difficult for him to overcome.
Berwood, a moment ago you talked a little bit about disenchantment that voters have for the two presidential major party candidates. Keeping that in mind, what value or risk is there if those presidential candidates endorse down-ticket candidates such as Trump endorsing Dave McCormick a few weeks ago when he was in Lehigh Valley?
Yeah, that was, it felt a little awkward, and you haven't heard McCormick touting that extensively, nor will you. I mean, I think a curious part of his advertising so far has been that he hasn't mentioned he's a Republican, at least in any of the advertising I've seen. So he's trying to run towards that center. He's got to, as I said, assemble a coalition that's more like a Pat Toomey coalition than a Donald Trump coalition. Toomey did that in 2016, running alongside Trump. We'll see if McCormick can pull that off. The difference is that Toomey ran multiple statewide campaigns, and running a campaign in Pennsylvania is a complicated thing. And so we'll see if McCormick's able to pull that off.
Yeah. I agree. It's interesting, McCormick's relationship with Trump, right? Trump endorsed Oz in the last Senate campaign, and in that primary, McCormick versus Oz. So McCormick sort of tried to run, at least on the abortion issue, to the right of Dr. Oz, and now he has to sort of swallow Trump's endorsement and reposition himself. I think this also raises the issue that Berwood alluded to of whether there's going to be any sort of coattails or any sort of effect that the presidential race has on the lower races, and actually whether there could be reverse coattails, from a Casey, for example, or a McCormick, whether there's enthusiasm for that race or congressional races that could help, either one of the presidential candidates.
Fletcher, do you think that it benefits Dave McCormick that the Republican State Committee basically cleared the field and endorsed him early on this time?
Oh, absolutely. Where you can direct your attention toward the general election and try to run sort of a centrist man of the people campaign that Berwood described.
You brought up the issue of Dobbs. I'd like to pose this to both of you. The Dobbs decision was credited or blamed with having a significant impact on the election 2 years ago. Does it still pack the same impact this time around?
I think it'll have an enormous impact. I think it's the one thing that will, one major thing that will stimulate turnout against, general sort of despair, apathy with the presidential candidates. It's been a winner in other parts of the country. I'm talking about a political winner for Democrats in the 2022 midterms, in the 2023 off elections. I think it has galvanized especially women of color, I think, and we're already, I think, possibly seeing the effect in the primary. There may be something to the vote for Nikki Haley, especially in suburban areas, that indicated that they're very much concerned about this issue.
Berwood, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this remains a vital issue. I think in 2022, you really had two issues. You had the economy and you had abortion rights. And they were, although leading into that race, many people thought the economy would take precedence. They were about equal when it came to choosing a candidate in the Senate and gubernatorial races in terms of their importance in the state. I think that remains true today. The economy gets all the attention. I think abortion rights remains a vital issue for many people. And I don't think it's going away. And I think the reason for that is twofold. First, Republicans still haven't figured out how to effectively message about the issue. And secondly, if it is a states' rights issue, as Republicans have described it, that means that whatever happens anything could happen in your state with the change of power, which I think keeps this issue alive for many people. And so until Republicans figure out a coherent strategy and coherent messaging around this, where there's some stability on this issue, I think it remains a problem for them.
Let's talk briefly about the row offices before we run out of time. First, the Attorney General's race. This will be wide open since Michelle Henry is not running for re-election. Jean DePasquale will be the Democratic nominee. Dave Sunday, the Republican nominee. What do you make of this matchup?
I think it's going to be extremely competitive. Most Attorney General's races are. I think we'll see whether messaging can kind of penetrate the sort of the buzz that will surround the presidential campaign. And remember, Pennsylvania is one of only a handful of swing states in the country. So we are going to be practically ground zero with the presidential campaign. And any row office trying to break through that messaging, I think, is going to be a challenge. Mr. DePasquale is known. He's a two-term Auditor General and fairly successful at that. Then he ran for Congress against Scott Perry in the 10th district and was competitive. That is a very competitive district, but I don't think anyone would say he ran the best campaign. Mr. Sunday, I don't think he has the name recognition of his opponent. And I think that nevertheless, it's interesting in the last presidential race in 2020 where President Biden won Pennsylvania by 80,000 votes. Republicans won the treasurer, they won a treasury race, or won Auditor General. So we'll see whether there's a ticket splitting this time around.
Bird, have you done much polling on any of the row offices to get a sense of how much voter enthusiasm or even how informed voters are on these races?
Yeah, we avoid that because typically there's no benefit in trying to ask people who don't know much about the candidates who they're going to vote for. And so we haven't done that. We'll probably do some of that in the fall as we move towards the race. I would add to what Fletcher said. In 2020, two of the row offices went Republican, even though Biden won. In 2016, Trump won the state, and all three row offices went Democratic. So there is some split ticket voting, some fall off among voters that makes it hard to predict those races. I think the Attorney General race, we were just talking about abortion rights, that race is going to be fought on those grounds, I suspect, because there is a big difference between the parties there. And we know that the role that state attorney generals have in dealing with federal regulations and laws that they don't support, right? They use lawsuits all the time. They use the courts all the time to react to those things. So I think that race is going to be interesting. It's going to be important. And Fletcher's right. I don't know how they cut through all the money being spent on the presidential and Senate race. That's going to be expensive. And so it might be a little lower key, but I think it will be really an interesting and close race, very likely. I mean, remember, Josh Shapiro won with 50.9% of the vote last time. So these races tend to be tight.
Let's move on briefly to the Auditor General's race. Malcolm Kenyatta will be the Democratic nominee facing incumbent Tim DeFore.
I would, since Mr. DeFore is the incumbent, has had 4 years to serve, I think he'll probably have an advantage. Mr. Kenyatta, Representative Kenyatta, I think is well known certainly in the Philadelphia region, and is a charismatic candidate, and certainly could be one of the things that could excite turnout actually in that area. So once again, I think, as with the Attorney General, I think all these offices are going to be pretty close races.
And briefly, the Treasurer's race, what was characterized as perhaps an upset. Erin McClellan will be the Democratic nominee. She was not endorsed by the party, but she will be running against incumbent Treasurer Stacey Garrity.
Right, and she herself attributes her victory to working very hard, traveling around the state, being a woman and being Irish. Unfortunately for her, she will be facing off against another woman, Stacey Garrity, although politically and in terms of ideology, they're very different.
Berwood, do you think that it benefits Erin McClellan that she's run for public office before she's previously run for Congress?
Well, running in a smaller district is different than running statewide. But I think there's an important point about the candidates in both of these row offices were discussing, and that is they're both from large urban centers. And if Malcolm Kenyatta can help boost the vote in Philadelphia, that certainly helps him. McClellan in Allegheny County, that helps her. I mean, really, her victory shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, the number of people who turned out in Allegheny County to vote far exceeded the number in Philadelphia. She was the only candidate from the West on the ballot, right? And our own research shows how vital that is in Pennsylvania primaries, having your home county support you. So, I don't think that was as big a surprise if you look at the things that helped decide Pennsylvania elections. But, in the long run, I think Democrats have to hope that they're able to boost turnout in their urban centers to help them across the board. And that includes these row offices.
What congressional races are you looking at as we head toward the fall? Berwood, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the 10th Congressional District in Central PA, the 5th, Scott Perry, incumbent Congressman Scott Perry against Janelle Stelson, a Democratic newcomer in some ways in terms of electoral office, but well known in this area for being on the news. Many expect the Democratic Party to really go after Perry hard. That's going to be an important race for control of the House. The 7th Congressional District and the 8th Congressional District up in the Lehigh Valley and the Scranton area, which are 2 seats held by Democrats. And in fact, the 8th Congressional District is a district that President Trump won. And the 7th is a perennial swing district. And then, of course, the 1st Congressional District, which is the Bucks County seat held by
Mike Fitzpatrick, or
Mike
Fitzpatrick.
Yes, Mike Fitzpatrick.
Brian.
Thank you.
Brian
I was thinking about his brother.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a seat that President Biden won comfortably in that district, but Fitzpatrick maintains his dominance there. So those are the 4 I'll be looking at closely. I mean, the advantage in the House is so narrow that all these races matter significantly.
Fletcher, any additional congressional races that you're looking at?
I guess those are the 4 that I would look at, and there are, as we mentioned with the Pennsylvania state legislature is the same thing. The margins are so narrow. The number of swing seats are relatively few, although we are seeing more and more retirements in Congress, but still they're relatively few. So there's going to be enormous resources, national resources, poured into this race. And of course, since we live here in central Pennsylvania, the 10th district with Perry and Stelson is going to be, a barn burner.
When you look at the results of what happened on primary election night, does that give any indication of the direction of both the state's Republican and Democratic parties, how conservative or progressive they may be at this point?
Well, one thing we've seen, and this has been a long-term trend, is that Republicans are gaining in party registration. There was a time not so very long ago where Democrats had like a million voter registration edge. And that margin's been narrowed to about 400,000, as I understand. Every county registered more Republicans and than Democrats so far in this election cycle. It has become, we're becoming close to sort of the ultimate purple state, in that regard. And as Berwood said, I think polarization is taking, some effect here. Republicans have become much more of a conservative party. The Democrats more liberal, although I guess I would argue Republicans even more conservative, sort of asymmetric polarization. And they've also become the party of Trump. So his fate, I think, is very much tied, Republicans' fate is very much tied to that of the former president.
Burr, just briefly, I'll give you the last word.
Well, look, I think the things are set the way they are. I think Fletcher's right about the trends in party registration. We've become a 50-50 state in many ways, and so every election is going to matter. I think the other part of this, though, is that we see an increasing number of voters who don't identify with either party. And that speaks to the disaffection. So you've got polarization and you have disaffection kind of driving our politics at the moment. And, I think that creates a great deal of instability, and it's hard to know where we're going to end up in a state that's as closely as divided as.
Berwood Yost, Fletcher McClellan, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. PCN's Ellen Front spoke earlier with Representative Jamie Barton about his bill to require more transparency in campaign finances.
Welcome to our program. Can you explain a bit about this bill?
Sure. Well, quite frankly, it's just about transparency and accountability. So if we think about campaign finance and all that, I guess the way we have to explain it, Ellen, is how do we do it now? In a campaign finance, let's just suppose I have a function for my campaign, and I have an event where I buy refreshments, maybe some paper products, and things like that. And I put that on my credit card, and I'm going to reimburse myself for that. All I have to do, and maybe that's $400. I don't know. Let's just use that as a round number, $400. All I have to do is put reimbursement $400. But let's suppose it was $4,000 or $400,000. All we have to do right now in Pennsylvania is write down reimbursement and the amount of money, whether that's $400 in the example I gave you or $400,000 in hypothetical, both hypothetical. And it just doesn't make sense to leave it that dark and untransparent.
Why is it so important for campaigns to disclose their spending habits?
Well, I think it's fair for people that support any candidate to know what that money's going for. I also think it's important that the candidates, it's transparent from a standpoint of what are we doing with money that was given to the candidate for a campaign. So it holds all candidates accountable for what they're doing. And this is something that I come from the business world. So as a business person, if I were to go on a sales trip, there may be gas mileage, there may be airfare, there may be hotel, there may be meals. And so when we do that in the business world, we come up with an expense account. It's a very simple spreadsheet, and you attach receipts to it, whether that's a credit card receipt or the receipts from each one, and it adds up, and it's exactly, and what it does is it documents and itemizes every single piece of that expense, of what's going on. And it allows people to see. Now, in the business world, that's going to be maybe your accounting or your payroll, or the owners of the company. From a campaign standpoint, when we see just reimbursement, we have no idea. We have no idea what that candidate's getting reimbursed for. And the other thing is, it's cumbersome to try to find out. It's the data's there, but it's cumbersome to go find it. I'm just this bill makes it very simple to do. And it's something that I believe all candidates are doing already. It just makes it open. I think that, look, I've been doing this about a year and a half now from a standpoint. I was elected, this is my first term. So it's something that people do on a regular basis. It just brings light to it and keeps it out of the shadows.
Are you aware of any specific examples or instances where a campaign was not honest with how they spent their money?
I'm not, but what was brought to light was this past summer there was an article that I saw regarding the HDCC executive director receiving large reimbursements that weren't itemized. Now, I don't know if that person did anything wrong or not, but it just brought to light, well, this is simple enough. Why don't you just, shed light on this? It's a very simple thing. So while I'm not suggesting that that person did anything wrong, it just certainly is a red flag that goes up from any person. I don't even think you have to be a business person, just a person to say, hey, wait a minute, there's something going wrong here. Why would you take that amount of money for a reimbursement and not show some sort of itemization and backup for that?
There are some people who have a distrust in campaigns or political people in the election process. Do you think that making it, open where people can see where the money is going in these campaigns will help people trust the election system a little bit more?
Absolutely. And I think, we as human beings, we buy from people we know, like, and trust. And I think we elect people we know, like, and trust as well, for the most part. And this, when you know that there's nothing hidden, everything's wide in the open, and there's nothing to hide, I think that adds a lot of transparency. I'm using the word transparency a lot. Forgive me for that. But we're opening it up to everybody. And keep in mind, we're not talking about red or blue. We're not talking about Democrat or Republican. This is for everybody. The piece that I referenced was the House Democrat Campaign Committee's executive, the executive director that showed this. But that just brings light to it. But this is for all candidates. This is something that everybody should be doing, I believe. And it's a very simple piece that does exactly what you said, Ellen. It just makes, I think, it's one less area that darkens politics, if you will.
Where is this in the legislative process? Are you confident that it can be passed in time before the general election in November?
Well, my goodness, I'd love to see this. It hasn't come out of committee. I've advocated for it, but unfortunately, it's just not made it out of committee yet. So we'll continue to push for that. And I would think it's something, as I mentioned before, this isn't red, this isn't blue, this isn't Democrat, this is a Republican. This is strictly something that I think I really believe it benefits everybody. It benefits candidates. It benefits people. It benefits, even though this isn't taxpayer money, it benefits taxpayers who are looking at their candidates and say, okay, I can see what you're doing.
Representative Jamie Barton, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ellen.
That concludes today's show. The PCN Capitol Preview returns tomorrow to discuss Governor's energy plan with Andre Beliveau of the Commonwealth Foundation and Robert Ruth of the National Resources Defense Council. That's tomorrow morning, live at 9 a.m. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.